Welcome to Unchosen Futures, the podcast where we pull up a chair, pour a cup of coffee, and dig into the stories society often tries to forget. So, to jump in here and start this off as a structural sociologist at the table, my name is Grace, and for our episode, we're looking at the sterilization of Indigenous and other marginalized women in Canada, and I want to frame it as a bioethical issue that's produced by systems, not just a few bad doctors. From a structural perspective, sterilization isn't a random mistake or a misunderstanding about consent. It's an outcome of institutions, laws, and policies that made it easier to control some women's reproduction than others. Karen Stokes' historical work shows that coercive sterilization was deeply connected to Canadian Indian policy, eugenics legislation, and economic interests, not just individual prejudice. Bioethically, the huge dilemma here is who gets to decide if someone can have children. On paper, the language is about consent and choice, but at the structural level, these choices were shaped by power, colonialism, and institutional racism. When a woman is told, sign this form, or you might lose your baby, or you won't get medical care, that is not free choice. That's coercion backed by state and medical authority. So the bioethical question isn't just, was the form signed? It's, what power relations made that signature almost inevitable? One of the key concepts I'm bringing in is structural violence. That's when social structures like health systems, welfare, and law systematically harm certain groups. In this case, women who are Indigenous, poor, disabled, or labeled unfit were more likely to be sterilized. Stoke argues that sterilization worked alongside other colonial policies to reduce the number of people the state was responsible for, and to clear a way for access to land and resources. That's not an accident. That is institutional racism. The harm is built into the design of the system. Another cluster of concepts I'm thinking about is medical authority, medicalization, and biopower. Stoke shows how medical professionals were positioned as the ones who knew what was best for Aboriginal women and their communities. That's medical authority. The idea that doctors and hospitals have legitimate power to define what counts as a health problem and what to do about it. Then there's medicalization, turning social judgments into medical diagnoses. Women who were poor in residential schools or in institutions could be labeled as mentally deficient, promiscuous, or unfit mothers, which justified sterilization as a treatment rather than punishment. And if we were to use the concept of biopower, the state is managing the population through health institutions, encouraging some women to produce while preventing others from having children at all. That's literally the state deciding whose lives are valued. What really shows this is structural is the forced and coerced sterilization didn't end with the old eugenics law. Ryan, Ali, and Schwarna looked at recent cases between 2015 and 2019 where over 100 Indigenous women came forward to say that they were sterilized without proper consent. Their study identifies 7 areas where change is needed, like accountability, legislation and policy, training and education, services and supports, and data collection. And every single one of those is system-level fix, not an individual one. That tells us something important for bioethics. You can't solve this by just telling one doctor to be nicer. You have to change the structures that allow coercion to happen in the first place. Things like how consent is obtained, how complaints are handled, and how racism is embedded in policy. Wrapping up my perspective, the key is, ethically, fixing consent forms isn't enough. We need system-level changes, laws, funding, training, and Indigenous-led health services that actually redistribute power and support reproductive justice. So if we're asking, what does an ethical health system look like? My answer would be, 1, where Indigenous women have full control over reproductive lives, where institutions are held accountable, and where structures that allow coercion for sterilization are dismantled rather than just apologized for. What are your thoughts on this, Chloe?
Wow, Grace, thank you for that very informative view on this topic that we're touching on. Now let's shift to my interactionalist perspective. Because one thing is that when we talk about coerced sterilization, we tend to focus a lot on the policies and structures, but much of the actual harm can come from very intimate, unequal interactions between women and the healthcare providers themselves. The issue in my mind is how did the social dynamic of these encounters shape what women felt like they could say, ask, or even refuse? Truly, many of the Canadian survivors have described the moments as not just failures of the policy, but failures of the communication, respect, and consent in real time. This can also be understood that power can even be exercised on a micro level. To start off with my interactionalist perspective, Canadian testimony makes it extremely clear that many women signed sterilization papers not because they freely chose to or wanted to, but because of the large amount of interactional coercion. The use of threats and pressure can also be seen in these situations. One example I can think of off the top of my head is the Saskatoon Health Region External Review, which many Indigenous women reported being told things like, "You need to sign this to see your baby again," or "Having more children would be irresponsible for someone like you," or even things like, "You're already under anesthesia, we can just do it now." These encounters reveal an entirely unheard of power imbalance, and these doctors' powers shape how women are interpreting the situations themselves, and many believe that refusal in the moment wasn't even an option. This raised the question for me of, was this even consent in the first place? A huge pattern we also see in Canadian testimony is the use of fear, especially fear of losing custody over one's children or being denied medical care as a whole. Another example that I can think of off the top of my head is the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which includes many statements of women who said that they only submitted sterilization papers because they feared social services would take their children, feared being labeled as a non compliant and being judged based on that, or being told that the procedure was just in their best interest, even after expressing confusion and not understanding. From my point of view, the understanding that fear is not only a side detail, but it's shaping the entire encounter themselves. A woman who is fearing of losing something or not doing something that is best for herself is what is coercing her to make these life altering decisions. Bioethically, this can be seen where emotional pressure can be just as coercive as any type of legal pressure. Continuing, a major theme within Canadian testimonies is also stigma, the idea that Indigenous women were seen as irresponsible or unfit mothers at the time. In the Senate of Canada's 2019 report, there were many women who said before entering the operating room they already felt judged. Assumptions that they already had too many children, assumptions that they were addicts or incapable, and assumptions that they were not competent as a parent. So many women had said they were spoken to as if their reproduction was a huge burden on the health system itself and not something that should be helped. From the interactionalist perspective, these judgments operate as a large amount of symbolic violence. Women are treated as if they shouldn't have more children, and this just creates moral coercion and not just procedural coercion. Wrapping up my perspective, bioethically, we are told that it emphasizes individual decision making, but interactionalism is showing us that the decisions are formed through relationships and situational interactions and interpretations. I think if we're trying to move forward and change the situation in the future, we would need to start implementing a few things, such as communication being trauma informed and culturally respectful, providers being trained with implicit bias, stigma, and colonial history, consent never being obtained during labor, anesthesia, or medical emergencies, other than maybe to save a life, and women also being able to ask questions without feeling fear or judgment. These are not only structural reforms, but interactional ones. Now I want to introduce Jasmine with a different viewpoint from the medicalization perspective. Bringing in new perspectives has really brought this topic into a new light, don't you think, Jasmine?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Thank you, Chloe. From a medicalization standpoint, this whole issue of forced and coerced sterilization in Canada really shows what happens when medical systems start treating social problems as things medicine should fix. One thing that stands out is how sterilization was often framed as a routine medical procedure, but the women experiencing it, especially Indigenous and intellectually disabled women, weren't actually given real control. Many were approached while in labor or immediately after childbirth, when they were exhausted and vulnerable. Some were pressured, some threatened, and some weren't fully informed about what the procedure meant for the rest of their lives. That's not consent in any meaningful sense. It's medical authority overriding autonomy. And this isn't an accident or a one-off situation. When you look at the history, sterilization was used as a tool of population control, justified under the language of health, safety, or what's best for the patient. That's classic medicalization, where a social judgment gets reframed as a medical decision. Here, the assumption was that certain women shouldn't or couldn't raise children, and medicine was positioned as the mechanism to enforce that.
From a macro perspective, this reflects a much broader pattern in public health. We rely heavily on biomedical solutions even when the real issues are structural. Instead of addressing what actually makes life hard for marginalized communities, like poverty, housing issues, or not having culturally safe care, the system keeps falling back on medical solutions. It individualizes the problem and ignores the context. And when you combine that with unequal power dynamics in healthcare, things get even more concerning. Medical professionals often have the final say, and policies or hospital practices can quietly limit people's choices. Even when institutions claim to support autonomy, the way decisions are made can still undermine it. Feminist ethicists point out that medical settings sometimes erase women's voices without meaning to, not through explicit force, but through subtle assumptions about what women should want or how they should live. In the case of sterilization in Canada, this meant that Indigenous women, whose communities had already been targeted by colonial medical policies, were placed in situations where their bodily autonomy was treated as negotiable. Some women were misinformed, others not informed at all, and many were left with long-term emotional, physical, and cultural consequences. Distrust of the healthcare system, trauma, and a sense of lost identity are not small harms. What really ties all this together for me as a medicalization sociologist is this. When medicine expands into areas shaped by racism, colonialism, and sexism, it doesn't stay neutral. It reinforces the power imbalances that already exist. In this case, medical authority didn't just treat illness, it controlled reproduction, shaped family structures, and affected whole communities for generations. So if we're talking about ethical healthcare, we can't just focus on the clinical moment or the consent form. We have to ask, who has the power in this interaction? Whose knowledge counts? And are we medicalizing problems that actually require social change, not surgical solutions? Because when medical systems lose sight of autonomy and equity, the consequences, as we've seen, are devastating. So overall, this lens really shows how medical power can shape people's lives in ways that go far beyond healthcare. When medicine takes on social problems, especially in unequal systems, people's autonomy can disappear. And that's why it's so important to question how medical decisions are made and who they serve. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Vani, who's taking us into the critical feminist perspective, looking at the power, sexism, and colonial dynamics behind who was targeted and why.
Thanks, Jasmine. So, the forced sterilization of women in Canada revealed the correlation between colonial histories and medical policy today. Colonial structures characterize Indigenous and disabled women as threats to society and legitimizing forced sterilization within our medical and legal systems. By framing reproductive control as being in the country's best interest, it normalizes gender-based violence and highlights colonial governance over women's bodies. Historically, colonial governments would use pseudoscientific language as a justification to have reproductive control over women. For example, a psychiatrist from the Easondale Provincial Mental Health Hospital in 1961 wrote, "This 22-year-old Indian girl is a known mental defective who has always been incorrigible, wild, underdisciplined, and promiscuous. Sterilization is therefore strongly recommended to prevent patients from having illegitimate children which the community would have to care for." From this, it becomes clear that Indigenous reproduction was considered to be a public burden. This reflects scientific racism, which is a process of labeling an entire population as biologically inferior to justify inequality. From a critical feminist theory standpoint, the description used does not reflect on one individual, but on the Indigenous population as a whole, indicating that Indigenous women's bodies are property of the state. It implies that Indigenous motherhood contradicts national progress, so the government must interfere for the good of society. To continue, the enforcement of sterilization is systemically organized. According to Alberta's eugenics program, both Alberta and British Columbia passed the Sexual Sterilization Acts that primarily targeted Indigenous and disabled women. This act demonstrates structural stigma, which is discriminatory ideas are embedded in our legal systems, hospitals, and public institutions, going beyond individual prejudice. From 1928 to 1972, the Alberta Eugenics Committee had the authority to sterilize people without obtaining consent if people were deemed to be mentally unfit. Indigenous and Métis people accounted for more than 25% of all sterilized patients, while representing only 2.5% of the population. Looking at these statistics, it clearly shows that sterilization policy was built on racist assumptions about who should or should not reproduce, since the main target of this policy is Indigenous women. The structural stigma theory defines sterilization as discrimination that is state-managed, as institutional and legal policy supports it. The act of sterilization is a reproductive governance strategy of the colonial state. The act of forced sterilization cannot be explained by gender alone. Intersectionality, which is the understanding of human beings shaped by the interaction within systems and structures of power, explains this as well. Women who have been affected by sterilization are targeted not only because they are women, but because they occupy multiple identities that are marginalized as well. So in a critical feminist perspective, we need to ask who was targeted and why. For this discussion, it is women who disrupt the colonial fantasy of obtaining national purity, therefore becoming targets of reproductive control. Understanding sterilization through an intersectionality lens, controlling women's reproduction is part of a significant effort to police Indigenous life, sexuality, and to stop community continuity. Reports of coerced sterilization show that colonial logic is based on the ideas of neoliberalism. Systems based on neoliberalism emphasize personal responsibility and limited government support. The issue with neoliberalism is that it does not recognize structural inequality and endorses the idea that individuals should be responsible for their own well-being and not rely on the state. This statement is important to consider because medical coercion uses terms like risk, responsibility, and burden to justify it, instead of providing essential services such as clean water, trauma intervention, safe housing, and healthcare. Indigenous women are pressured to undergo sterilization for the purpose of reducing social costs. Rather than considering sterilization as a violation of bodily autonomy, it is deemed necessary in the economic sense to lessen the financial burden, showing that structural restriction is cheaper and more beneficial to society than actually pushing for structural change. Critical feminist scholars put focus on the fact that forced sterilization is not the attack on the individual, but on Indigenous women as a whole. Attacking on Indigenous motherhood is an attack on the survival of Indigenous nations, cultures, and traditions for future generations. Traditionally, women are responsible for passing on cultural values, so by sterilizing them, it prevents the development of identity, transition of language, and land ties. Under Article 2 of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, it says imposing measures intended to prevent birth within a group is classified as genocide. This means forced sterilization is a political crime due to the intentional effort to reduce Indigenous populations. Ultimately, analyzing sterilization through a critical feminist lens showcases reproductive governance is a form of gendered state violence rooted in colonial ideals. To address forced sterilization meaningfully, Canada needs to recognize it as a systemic violation of bodily autonomy, human rights, and Indigenous sovereignty.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Unchosen Futures. These are difficult topics, but important ones. Take care, and we'll see you next time.